Let's jump in. I want to do a quick review because I want to spend, obviously, the majority of our time on Revelation chapter 12, which is an awesome chapter, and I hope we will all enjoy it. But real briefly, more briefly than we've done in the past, here's the first 11 chapters, which, as I mentioned on Sunday, really is kind of the first half of the book. Anybody you see kind of draw up an outline or structure of the book is more than likely going to say chapter 11 is kind of a midway point, and something new is beginning in chapter 12 to the end of the book, okay? But what we've seen is after a introduction to the vision, right? Revelation means exactly that. It's a revealing. And so John is seeing a vision that takes up most of the chapters in the book. But before that vision, he sees Jesus, in particular, in chapter 1, standing among the lampstands, which represents the churches. And then those 7 churches, they are actual churches, actual groups of real people in Roman Asia there in the first century. And they are each addressed with a few verses of exhortation in chapters 2 and 3. Each of them is charged to hear what the Spirit has to say to them. And all of them are encouraged to conquer, right? So that they can have their share in the reward that is stored up for God's people, okay? So that is kind of the foundation. These are the people. These are the recipients of the letter. These are the people that are being addressed with this grand vision that John is seeing and recording. We jump into the vision. Chapters 4 and 5 serve in their own way to set up what is to come. We see God on the throne in all of His majesty in chapter 4, praised as the creator of all things. And then we see the Lamb show up in chapter 5 as the only one worthy to open the scroll in the hand of God who sits on the throne. And we've suggested that this scroll is or represents God's plan, specifically for dealing with wickedness, judging evil, and rescuing His righteous saints. Okay? No one else can be the one to fulfill, right, or for God to use to carry out or to bring that plan to its fruition, except Jesus, the Son of Man, the Lamb who was slain, the Lion of the tribe of Judah. So He is worthy to open the scroll, and that scroll begins to be opened in chapter 6. And so then we have 2 cycles here of 7 judgments. The first cycle are these 7 seals. 6 of them are opened in chapter 6, unleashing judgments upon the earth. Then there is an interlude in chapter 7 in which we see God's people as an innumerable host from every tribe and nation that are sealed by God and going to be brought through the tribulation. Not exempt from tribulation, but brought through it to God's throne on the other side of death. Okay? And then after that interlude, the seventh seal is broken in chapter 8. There is silence in heaven, and as we anticipate the next cycle of 7, which is the 7 trumpets. And that's what we've seen in chapters 8 to 11. Similar pattern, 6 trumpets are blown in chapters 8 and 9, unleashing God's wrath upon the earth. And then there is an interlude in chapters 10 and 11. In chapter 10, we see John's calling of sorts in the fashion of Ezekiel. He has to eat the scroll. Maybe the same scroll, maybe just the same idea, but eat God's message, which is sweet, but then bitter. I think because of its message of judgment and of salvation. Okay, that's in chapter 10. And then in chapter 11, we see another picture of the church, this time not as the first interlude showed us, an innumerable host, but in chapter 11, we see a picture of the church represented by 2 witnesses. And these witnesses stand in the streets of the great evil city, and they prophesy against that city. They call it out for its injustice and for its idolatry. And they speak with God's authority, but then they are struck down and killed by the beast. And the world rejoices that these tormenting prophets have been struck down and killed, but then they are raised by God's power and they ascend into heaven. They win their victory, and the result of that is that people come to repentance. Okay? And then that leads us then to the blowing of the 7th trumpet, this picture of really the end, the culmination of all of God's prophecies, everything being fulfilled in the blowing of the 7th trumpet. Okay? Again, as we mentioned before, like if you read the book of Isaiah or Ezekiel or Jeremiah, any of the prophets, these are not linear chronological things, okay? If you're reading through the book of Isaiah, you can read one passage of judgment, and then you can keep reading through the book and come to another passage of judgment. That's really talking about the same thing as the previous passage, but now just giving you a different flavor, or a different angle on that. In the same way, the book of Revelation, don't think that, well, the seventh trumpet in chapter 11, that was the end, like the end, which I think it is, okay? Well, what it left is there to say in the last 11 chapters? Well, again, we're going to be exploring these same themes and these same ideas from different angles, and that's what we're going to see in the rest of the book, okay? I did want to point out one other thing, just because it's on the slide here. I mentioned this at the end of class on Wednesday, okay? But keeping in mind the power of God, the majesty of God, there's kind of an interesting repetition that takes place in this first half, and actually we'll see it again later on in Revelation. In chapter 4, when God is on the throne, when we first see this scene of the one sitting on the throne, we read in chapter 4 and verse 5 that from the throne come flashes of lightning, rumblings, and peals of thunder. Okay? So fire, rumblings or sounds, and thunder. Okay? Well, at the end of each of these cycles, the cycle of seals and the cycle of trumpets, we get a very similar description. In chapter 8, in verse 5, after the seventh seal is broken and the trumpets are handed out, it says that there were from the altar peals of thunder, rumblings, flashes of lightning, and now an earthquake is added to the mix. And then at the end of the seventh trumpet, at the end of chapter 11, it says that God's temple in heaven was opened in verse 19. The Ark of the Covenant was seen within his temple, and there were flashes of lightning, rumblings, peals of thunder, an earthquake, and heavy hail. And so each time we see these descriptions, at the end of a judgment cycle, we are brought back to the throne room, and we are reminded again of God's power, reminded again of his majesty, reminded again that he is the one that is sitting on the throne in glory, and that his holiness then is enacting these judgments that are being poured out upon the earth. Okay? Like I said, this is basically the first half of Revelation here, so you can congratulate yourself. You made it this far. And hopefully you understand more than when we started a couple months ago. But let's jump into chapter 12. I think that, again, this chapter will be, when we see it for what it is, enjoyable. And I actually think it's easier to pick up on, perhaps, than what we saw in chapter 11 on Sunday. But I'll let you guys be the judge of that. Let's read it all, chapter 12. And this is a story being told, almost a comic strip-like story here in chapter 12. So let's read it and see it in your mind's eye happening, and see if you can pick up on just the basic storyline, the plot line of Revelation chapter 12. The text says, "A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun, with the moon under her feet, and on her head a crown of 12 stars. She was pregnant and was crying out in birth pains and the agony of giving birth. And another sign appeared in heaven. Behold, a great red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns, and on his heads 7 diadems. His tail swept down a third of the stars of heaven and cast them to the earth. And the dragon stood before the woman who was about to give birth, so that when she bore her child, he might devour it. She gave birth to a male child, one who is to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. But her child was caught up to God and to his throne. And the woman fled into the wilderness, where she has a place prepared by God, in which she is to be nourished for 1,260 days. Verse 7. Now war arose in heaven. Michael and his angels fighting against the dragon. And the dragon and his angels fought back, but he was defeated. And there was no longer any place for them in heaven. And the great dragon was thrown down, that ancient serpent who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. He was thrown down to the earth, and his angels were thrown down with him. And I heard a loud voice in heaven saying, Now the salvation and the power and the kingdom of our God and the authority of his Christ have come. For the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, who accuses them night and day before our God. And they have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony. For they loved not their lives, even unto death. Therefore rejoice, O heavens, and you who dwell in them. But woe to you, O earth and sea, for the devil has come down to you in great wrath, because he knows that his time is short. And when the dragon saw that he had been thrown down to the earth, he pursued the woman who had given birth to the male child. But the woman was given the 2 wings of the great eagle, so that she might fly from the serpent into the wilderness, to the place where she is to be nourished for a time, times, and half a time. The serpent poured water like a river out of his mouth after the woman, to sweep her away in a flood. But the earth came to the help of the woman, and the earth opened its mouth and swallowed the river that the dragon had poured from his mouth. Then the dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring and on those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. Okay. So we've kind of stumbled upon, in some ways, these 4 tools in our toolbox, things that we can use for making some sense, not answering every question necessarily, but making some sense out of things in Revelation. In this case, we're going to look at chapter 12. Okay, one of those is to identify key points. Okay, we can call these anchors, or you can call this kind of putting your stake in the ground and saying, I get this, right? A lot of stuff I don't understand, I can at least get this. Oftentimes because the text is very explicit about some things, when it's not very explicit about a lot of other things. And in this chapter in particular, there are, I'm going to say 2, maybe there are more, but there are at least 2 figures in the chapter that I think are very clearly and explicitly hard to miss who these figures represent or are. We could just say who they are, right? In Revelation chapter 12, what are the easy ones? 1 or 2 that are easy. Brian? Okay. Why do you say that Brian says the male child is Jesus? Why do you say that that is clear? We're saying in bold and italics here. This has to be clear. Why do you say it's clear that the male child is Jesus?
To kill the child. Satan, the dragon, is seeking to kill the child. It's a male child, and he was caught up to God and to his throne. And then what seems to solidify it to me is that the offspring of the child, just read it. The dragon was enraged with the woman and went off to make war with the rest of her offspring. So we're engaged in a spiritual battle. And who is that offspring? Those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus.
Okay. So let's just stick with Jesus for now, because I do think the other stuff is not as clear. Not that it's not correct, but it's you're putting together pieces and cross-referencing and all this kind of stuff. What I'm asking here is the text tells us straight up, if you want to use that terminology, who 2 of the characters are. Okay, one of them is Jesus, and I will give you that one. And in particular, in verse 5, it says the male child is the one to rule all the nations with a rod of iron. Okay. Anybody know where that's a quotation from? What did you say, Patty? What did you say? It could be right. I mean, Anybody have a cross-reference in there? Rule the nations with a rod of iron. Psalm 2. Yep, Psalm 2. Okay. Which is clear now, but even for for Jews and for centuries was like the most messianic passage in the Old Testament. Okay, so Jesus is the male child, and the other one, Brian actually mentioned it. The other clear, explicit, correlation in this chapter, other character that's clear. We're told, by the way, in case you missed it, this is who this is. Yeah, the dragon. And the dragon is the Satan or the devil. By the way, those are I guess in school today we say common nouns versus proper nouns. Devil and Satan are not proper noun names, at least it appears. They are common nouns. The word devil means an accuser, someone who accuses. You think of like a prosecuting attorney, okay? No, that was not meant to be any kind of slight, comparing, prosecuting attorneys and the devil. Just I'm saying that's what the word means. And then the Satan is the adversary. That word just means adversary in the original text, okay? But the dragon is that figure. And again, it's very clear because he says this is the one who is called the devil and Satan, the deceiver of the whole world. And then the male child is Jesus. And then beyond that, there's some other things, almost like we miss it. I mean, Michael, the archangel, or the angel, I should say, and his angels, they're just named. That's nothing kind of veiled or hidden there. And then Brian referred to this as well. But you get to a point like in verse 10, when it says that the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, okay? Or as Brian mentioned later on, it mentions those who keep the commandments of God and hold to the testimony of Jesus, okay? This is, clearly referencing God's people, Christians, those who are faithful to Christ. So you see the story playing out in Revelation 12. You can actually put some anchors down and say, okay, I know who the dragon is. The dragon is Satan. I know who the male child is. The male child is Jesus. We see other kind of explicit references to the good angels, right, and the bad angels, and the people of God in the midst of all of this, okay? And then someone else give me what you see. What are the clear, actually I think I have 3 different questions here. The clear plot points. Again, this is very much like comic strip, storyboard kind of stuff going on in Revelation 12. So let's start with this. What's the dragon's first aim as the story opens up in Revelation 12? What's the dragon trying to do? Yeah, devour. I think this is what was said. There's a lot of at once. Devour the child that's going to be born by this woman. Okay, is he successful in that? No, he's not. Okay, what happens to the child? Taken to heaven. Okay, what happens next? The dragon is, he's conquered. And who conquers the dragon? One answer is that it's Michael and the angels, it says in verse 7, fought against him. But when a loud voice speaks from heaven in verse 10 and verse 11, who does that voice say conquered the dragon? Well, by the blood of the Lamb, who conquered? Not what the text says. Who did the conquering by the blood of the Lamb? Who is the subject of this verb? We, right, or the text says, the accuser of our brothers has been thrown down, and they, verse 11, have conquered him by the blood of the Lamb and by the word of their testimony, for they love their lives, they love not their lives even unto death. So just kind of, again, for whatever sense we can make of it, kind of at the same time we have these 2 realities running parallel. One reality is the heavenly reality in which Michael and his angels are waging the war and casting Satan down. They are the one conquering. And this other reality, in the earthly reality, it's the saints on earth that through their sacrificial martyrdom, basically, giving up of their lives, and of course, all of that happening by God's power and by the blood of the Lamb. But in the earthly reality, it is the saints who are conquering Satan by the testimony and by the blood of the Lamb. And so then, having been cast down to the earth, what then in the final kind of frame here in 13 to 17, what's the Satan's response? He is mad. Okay. Yeah, that's great. I should put that on the slide. He's starting to cause some ruckus, Patty says. Okay, that's exactly it. Okay, that's exactly it. He's mad. I mean, probably all of us or many of us have had this experience with an animal, right? It's angry, and then you do something to it to harm it, and it's just even more angry, okay? But the dragon is furious that he has been cast down, and so he is going to do as much damage as he can in his rage now on the earth, okay? That's the basic story. So we've done pretty well, even just with this first tool, okay? Who are the figures that we can identify? What's the basic storyline of the drama? Make sense? And we've gotten, I don't know, we're halfway there at least, I think. Okay? Brian, one more comment before we move on here?
It appears to me that the war in heaven continues in this realm today, in the spiritual battle we're engaged in. It's spoken of in Ephesians 6.
So yeah, I think what we just described of the heavenly reality and the earthly reality running kind of parallel and having to do with one another. They're not separate. They're linked. I mean, that's one of the messages of the entire book of Revelation. right? That our reality down here is not all there is. There is this heavenly reality that's running parallel, other dimension, and they are, inseparably linked to one another. So what happens in one reality affects what happens in the other reality, and appears vice versa, according to chapter 12. Okay. All right. So that's one tool. Identify easy things, low-hanging fruit in the text, and we've done that. Okay. What about biblical patterns? Let me ask you this: what images or elements of Revelation chapter 12 do you remind you of a previous Bible story? Any elements, figures, pictures, events, anything that reminds you of an Old Testament story? Fidencia, this I'm getting a.
I don't know what you call them. The three. I'm sorry. The three. What do you call them? That we're supposed to go back to Herod?
Oh, the three wise men. Yeah,
the three wise men.
Or magi.
They're supposed to go back, and then he finds out, and then he wants to kill all the two babies that are.
Okay.
So that's a very similar story to the.
Okay, so thank you, Fidencio. Think of Herod trying to literally kill the babies during the time of Christ. Okay, what else are you reminded of in other Bible stories when you read Revelation 12?
I'm trying to remember.
Floating lamb.
Huh?
Floating lamb, you say?
Yeah, it was a study of the prophet, the most recent prophet,
From Ezekiel?
where he has an animal and it's ugly and disfigured, and something is. I remember something.
You're probably right. I'm not trusting my own memory here.
Yeah.
So.
But just the lamb slaying the beast.
So for sure, the slain lamb, we don't have to go back very far. It takes us to Revelation 5, right? We've seen Jesus, the slain lamb, conquering as a slain lamb, okay? And then you could go back in the lamb imagery, and the slain, conquering of the lamb even, again, has its own. But we'll figure it out. We'll put our heads together, figure it out later. Because I trust you. Mike?
How about Eve with the serpent in Genesis?
Okay, this is not the first time we've seen a woman and a snake squaring off, okay? And in fact, what did God say after Eve lost that first run-in with the snake? What was God's promise? And who was that was going to do that? Well, but it doesn't say. Who does it say in the text is going to do that? The offspring of the woman, right? So the picture is that, Eve loses the first bout to the snake, right? The first woman, she goes head to head with the snake, and the snake wins. But the promise is that this conflict is going to continue throughout all of human history. And eventually the woman is going to be victorious, because it's going to be her offspring that crushes the head of the snake. Okay? So we're reminded of Genesis 3. That should be in our minds. Okay? Other images of other Bible stories that jump out at you from Revelation 12? Let's go Rick and then Fidencio.
Daniel 7, the beast with 10 horns.
Okay.
Very similar imagery. Back then it's referring to the fourth kingdom, which is Rome, and in this case it's referring to the dragon. But in some sense, you could see the dragon, Satan, working through Rome to
Sure.
damage the church and Christians.
Sure, which will absolutely be the case as we go forward into chapter 13. But yeah, even just that association with the kind of force of darkness and evil that comes up out of the water in Daniel, we have that in our mind for this big bad dragon. You say the same thing? Okay, Brian, one more.
First woman in the wilderness, and I think of Hebrews chapter 4, where in a sense, in this life, we're in the wilderness heading towards the promised land, and in the promised land you have to persevere and to conquer the evil, if you will, to enter into the promised land. So I'm not sure what the imagery of the woman is, because I'm thinking first it's Mary, and then it seems to me possibly the church. But at any event, we'll die in the wilderness if we're not saved by Christ, and we entered into the promised land, which is heaven, which is the promised rest on the Sabbath.
Okay, thank you, Brian. So think about this idea of wilderness, because in the story of the Exodus, that's where this starts, right? All the stuff you're referring to is just the later iterations of the Exodus story, okay? And in the Exodus story, the people are delivered from the jaws of Pharaoh in Egypt, and they're delivered where? Where is their place of protection? Ironically, the wilderness, right? They escape into the wilderness, okay? Which, of course, they cynically turn around and say, really, God, you delivered us from that death to bring us to another death in the wilderness? But this idea of the wilderness being the place of protection, okay, goes back to the Exodus story, actually goes back further than that. When Hagar is, the mistress of Abraham, when she's kicked out of Abraham's house, she goes into the wilderness, and she is protected, nourished by God there, she and Ishmael. But I think particularly here in view is the Exodus story, the escape from, their own dragon, so to speak. By the way, Egypt was referred to in Scripture as a multi-headed snake because of the Nile River, the delta there splitting off into multiple channels there. So the Psalms, the prophets talk about Egypt as this multi-headed snake. The dragon is slain, and the people are brought out on eagle's wings, by the way, Exodus says, into the wilderness. So the wilderness is their protection, but it also ends up being their place of trial and tribulation as well. Okay, we need to run through this here. Satan's fall, we might have alluded to this passages already in this class, but Jesus says in Luke 10 that he saw Satan fall like lightning out of heaven. The devil standing as the accuser before the brothers. It reminds us of Zechariah 3 in the story where the high priest, Jeshua, representing the people as the high priest does, is standing before God in filthy garments, okay, soiled garments, okay, and the devil is right there in the presence of God, accusing Jeshua and saying, this guy is guilty before the Lord. And he is guilty. It's obvious. He's soiled. His garments are soiled. And yet God rebukes Satan and gives Joshua, representing the people, new festive white clean robes there to stand before him in his presence. So that is in view here as the devil is accusing our brothers, conquering of the slain lamb we mentioned. And then don't miss, we mentioned this on Sunday, but multiple times in this section, we have first in verse 6 that the woman is in the wilderness for 1,260 days. Remember, that's 3.5 years. And then the same idea, the woman is in the wilderness in verse 14 for time, times, and half a time. That's 1 plus 2 plus a half. That's 3.5. And that stands for a temporary time, a time of tribulation, but a time that does not last forever. Okay. So what we're doing in this tool in our toolbox is just reminding us of where we've seen these images before and what significance they might bring to the present moment. Ian, one thing from you, and then we'll
yeah, I guess I just, the bullet point that's popping out at me here is the the wilderness. How many times in the Bible do we see people fleeing to the wilderness to be closer to God? Moses, Jesus, John the Baptist. There's plenty of examples of that. Even God's people were brought into the wilderness, but it's for a purpose. It was for a purpose, right? Take them out of civilization, out of the evil that's going on to the world, and isolate them, and just have a place where God's people can be close to God. And I think that's the message to us where we think about our life today. We might go on a hike somewhere in Colorado, and we're like, man, this is amazing. It's God. We can see God's wonder in all things, and we feel closer to Him. I think there's an essence of that we can take advantage of by separating ourselves from the rest of the world.
Oh, thank you, Ian. But is it easy? Well, the wilderness actually in the Bible ends up, for all the things that you're saying, and it says here about being nourished by God, it also ends up being a difficult time as well. All right, maybe we'll real quickly just run through these last two and then talk more in detail about Revelation 12. One of the other tools was put it in context. So at this point in Revelation 12, we are kind of in a new story. So now as we go forward, we'll have to not forget, the story that started here in chapter 12 on Sunday. I'm going to ask you, okay, let's think about where we are in the story, so on and so forth. At this point, we're kind of in a new section, but yet we can still ask ourselves, okay, what themes have we seen in Revelation 1 to 11 that are being kind of reiterated here in chapter 12? Okay, we've already talked about the theme in chapter 12 that there's a heavenly reality that runs parallel and affects the earthly reality. We have talked about previously in the book, we saw that the evil one is at work, that if we take the kind of the chief of destruction in chapter 9 that comes up out of the pit, that's cast down from heaven and unleashes the pit of hell as the Satan, then we've seen that already here in Revelation. We've already seen the idea of God being ultimately victorious through the Lamb, and we've already talked about the paradox of conquering through suffering, and all those things are coming up here again in chapter 12. And then maybe we'll be able to come back to this, but don't forget, even if we're rushing through it in class for time's sake, as you read chapter 12, think to yourself, what would this have meant for those same churches that were being addressed back in chapter 2 and 3? So again, a good exercise. The church at Ephesus, they've lost their first love, and God is challenging them to repent, to go back to the love they had at first. As they're sitting there listening to this story in Revelation 12, what would it do for them? The church that has left their first love, okay? Or the church in Thyatira that's putting up with Jezebel, who's, calls herself a prophetess, but is seducing servants to practice sexual immorality, the compromising church. As they're sitting here listening to this drama of the dragon and the woman and the angelic battle and all of that, how would this be striking them? And what would it mean for them? Or for the church in Smyrna, that they're really going through a hard time. They're being persecuted. They're being maybe even put to death for their testimony, and yet they're trying the best they can to hold on and be faithful. What would Revelation 12 mean for them? What confidence would it give them? What encouragement to hold on would it give them? And those are the kind of questions that we want to ask all the way through the book of Revelation. Okay, well, let's do this. Let's run through some details, at least some of the details, not all of them, although we've already hit on quite a few of them. So 3 sections I'll kind of break up here for chapter 12. The first frame, we have the woman versus the dragon, okay? And I'm going to say that the woman here, and this is kind of broad, the broadest sense, again, going back to the Eve story, you could say the woman represents humanity. And maybe not necessarily all of humanity, but maybe more specifically faithful humanity. And most particularly, maybe you would say Israel. I mean, think about the passages of the Old Testament that talk about Israel as being the bride of God, right? That's all over, okay? So Israel as this kind of exalted woman, and it is out of Israel, again, in a broader sense, out of humanity, that the Christ is born. Christ is born, of course, of the line of David, of the people of Israel. He's born the Son of Man. He's born a human. It's interesting to me, all that you could say about the labor pains, right? The difficulty by which the Christ came into the world. The story of Israel is a painful story. The story of humanity is a painful story leading up to the birth of the Christ of Mary, okay? And since I said the name and Brian mentioned it earlier, I think to see the woman here as Mary is just it's too narrow, okay? And it doesn't fit with the rest of the story in terms of the woman fleeing into the wilderness and being, pursued by the dragon and all of that, okay? So more broadly speaking, the woman here is the people through which the Messiah comes, whether you want to say that's Israel specifically or humanity more broadly, okay? And the devil, as we said, tries to thwart God's plan. Fidencio brought up the Herod story. Again, the Herod story is one instance that makes this point very vividly, okay? And with Revelation 12 in our heads, right, we understand, again, the earthly reality was Herod, being paranoid of another king being born, and in his kind of, crazed political mind, wanting to kill all the 2-year-old boys, okay? That's the earthly reality. Revelation 12 says in the heavenly reality what's going on. Satan is doing all he can to make sure that child doesn't make it, right? Isn't born or is killed early. So you see what I'm saying? And then you could keep going. There's other examples of that same basic idea. Satan's trying to thwart the plan of God, even from the beginning. And yet he's unsuccessful. And in a very quick one verse, right? The whole story of Jesus is summarized by saying, her child was caught up to God and to his throne, right? And that means he was born, he lived, he died, he was resurrected, and he ascended into heaven. All of that's kind of compressed into he was caught up into heaven. But we know, again, from the other places in Revelation, that he is overcome through his death and his resurrection. Okay? So that's the first frame, the woman and the dragon. Okay? And the dragon's unsuccessful. Following that, then, the dragon goes to war. Or we could say Michael and his angels go to war against the dragon. Okay? And putting all this together, right, the end of the first frame is Jesus' victory. And the result of that is the devil is cast out of heaven. Okay? I don't think it necessarily is helpful to get real specific and to say, was Jesus' death the moment that Satan was, cast out of heaven, or was his resurrection was the moment, right, that Satan was cast out of heaven? This came up with somebody the other day. It is interesting that every time you find this Satan figure in the Old Testament, he's in the presence of God. Okay? Garden of Eden, story of Job, the Zechariah story I mentioned earlier, and there's one or two other instances where it appears that's who's being described, and he's in the presence of God. Okay? And I think you have to conclude, based on everything we know about God and his creation, that Satan and his angels are created beings that were good in their creation, but rebelled. They have some amount of will, obviously, and they rebelled and they turned against God, okay? But this chapter here is describing how that story plays out. They are unsuccessful in their rebellion, and because of Jesus and his victory, they are cast out of heaven onto the earth, okay? But again, we saw this already, Christ's victory is not just a heavenly reality, it's an earthly reality as well. And those who follow the example of the Lamb and they don't love their life to the point that they're willing to be put to death, to follow in the Lamb's footsteps, they also conquer with Jesus. But having been cast out, the dragon then goes to war against the offspring, as Brian mentioned earlier. That is the people of God. The Bible talks about the other kind of brothers, right? After the Son of God, many sons are brought to glory. He is the firstborn among many brethren. And so the offspring of the woman, the other offspring of the woman, are the people of God, and the devil is now after them. He couldn't get the Christ, right? He couldn't get the male child. He couldn't get the woman, and so he goes after the other offspring. And that's really where the chapter ends, in verse 17. The dragon became furious with the woman and went off to make war on the rest of her offspring, on those who keep the commandments of God and hold the testimony of Jesus. And he stood on the sand of the sea. Now, we're going to read in the next verse and in the next chapter how it is, specifically, that the dragon goes about making war on God's people. The details of that are still to come. But for now, we know at least this much. The devil's been conquered. He's been cast out of heaven onto the earth. And now, as Patty said, he is making as much of a ruckus as he can. And he is specifically after God's people to do as much damage to them as possible, but only because he's already received his mortal wound, right? And so now he's flailing about as violently as he can in his fury, going against the people of God. So here's the question I want to ask you. We got about 6 minutes here, okay? Yeah, go ahead, Brian.
At verse 13, it says the dragon persecutes the woman, and the only persecution I'm aware of is the persecution against Christ. Is that if I'm persecuted, they'll persecute you, and it seems to be the persecution of the church. So can we more narrowly define the woman as the church, which consists of the brothers of Christ who conquer?
I would tend to keep it more general, but maybe say if the woman is Israel, right? But not just Israel of the flesh, it's the true Israel, okay, which is before and after Jesus is born, right? So it is through Israel that Jesus comes, but then after Jesus, you see this kind of transition away from Israel as the Jews to Israel as the people of God, and perhaps the story here kind of captures that as the woman is first persecuted before it shifts over to the offspring, right? So she still represents the people of God after the birth of the child, because the people of God are persecuted after Jesus. Okay, so here's my question. Again, heavenly reality and earthly reality. we are told in Revelation 12 that this is the reality. Just because we can't see it doesn't mean it's any less real. In fact, it's more real. But the reality is that Satan has been defeated by the work of Christ. And the reality is that he has been cast out and that he is mad. And that he is made as his specific target the saints, the brothers, the people of God. And with his dying, gasping moments, he is going to do as much damage as he possibly can to those people who happen to be us sitting in this room, right? So what changes about our life if we woke up every morning with this reality on our hearts and minds? What would that change? You tell me. Let's discuss this as we close out here. Robert, Ian, y'all decide who wants to go first here.
I was just thinking about the perspective of the churches in chapter 2, 3, and us. If we really take to heart chapter 12 and understand that there's a spiritual battle going on and that God's victorious, then everything else that we're doing and all the problems that they described in chapter 2 and 3 are petty, meaningless, and who cares? Put them out of our way, with the focus on God.
Thank you, Robert. Ian?
Yeah, I mean, if you're not a Christian, it's to say that you need Christ in your life. But if you are a Christian and you're being persecuted by the wrath of Satan, you know that's present in our reality, then it should just amplify that. It should amplify the fact that you need to be close to Christ. If Christ casts him out, if Christ's death casts Satan out of our world, then it's Christ that's going to keep him at bay. It's not us. It's Christ through us that's going to keep him at bay.
Thank you, Ian. They conquered him by the blood of the Lamb, by the word of their testimony, for they loved not their lives even unto death. What else would you say about how Revelation 12 changes things, changes our reality once we see this as our narrative kind of in our life? Michael, what do you think?
I'm reminded, I guess it just didn't necessarily change. This statement isn't a change of perspective, but just a revisiting of the 1 Peter passage where Satan's a roaring lion seeking to devour. When I read this text, I mean, what's been said is definitely, I feel that, but I also, it's like, take care, and then how do you do that? How do you defend yourself against, because there is a target on your back, as one of God's children, or so just making sure you're protecting yourself, spending time in the Word, praying to God, staying connected, with your brothers and sisters in Christ, all the things that would keep you strong.
No, thank you, Michael.
Can I just add
Yeah,
on top of that? Because I think it for us, it reaffirms that, not reaffirms, but it makes it obvious that we can be cast out just like Satan was cast out. God, if Satan had the will to choose whether he wanted to be good or evil, he chose evil, and he was cast away from the presence of God. And ultimately, that will be the case for us if we choose evil over good.
Amen. There's two sides, right? You're on one side or the other. Robert, you back in?
Yeah, if you take away all the spiritual applications and just think about, hey, what side do you want to be on? Which one's going to win? We're already told the answer.
Yeah.
So why don't you want to be on the winning side?
Yeah. And that's one of the thing that's so powerful to me about Revelation, one of the things that's so powerful about Revelation 12, is that, again, this is the bittersweet, or sweet bitter, right, scroll that John consumed and is now relaying onto us, okay? It's sweet because we know the battles, we know the war is won, okay? It's decided, right? Jesus has conquered, and we know that's how it's going to end, and so we just got to hold on to him, and we'll be brought through, to the victory, right? At the same time, okay, because Satan has been defeated, that he's enraged and that he's doing all that he can to put the target on our back, as Michael said, and come after us. And so, yes, we should not be discouraged. We should be encouraged. No, well, Satan's only throwing the kitchen sink at me because he knows he's lost. At the same time, Satan is throwing the kitchen sink at me, and that should sober me up. And it's a hard pill to swallow. But okay, I got to go get Asher. So I think that was the